I'll call to order the Village of Riverside Planning and Zoning Commission regular meeting and public hearing for Wednesday, September 23rd, 2020. Please call the order. Please call the roll.
Commissioner May?
Here.
Commissioner Hennigan?
Here.
Commissioner Marhold?
Here.
Commissioner Miller?
Here.
Commissioner Pelletier?
Here.
Commissioner Matthews?
Here.
Chairperson Mateo?
I'm here.
We have a quorum.
Is there a motion to approve the minutes of the Planning and Zoning Commission regular meeting and public hearing minutes of August 26, 2020?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any changes? I had sent Management Analyst Bowman a couple of minor changes. Any other changes people have? Call the roll.
Okay. Commissioner May?
Aye.
Commissioner Hennigan?
Aye.
Commissioner Marhold?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner Pelletier?
Aye.
Commissioner Matthews?
Aye.
Chairperson Mateo?
Yes.
Motion passes.
I don't see our village liaison. Do you have any updates from the board?
Yes, we had both the swim club and the variation were on village board agendas last month. The swim club was approved, however, they did change the conditions for it. Ultimately, they allowed for just the 6-foot setback for the fence and asked that a continuous landscape row be planted in front of it, and they also requested that a public sidewalk be installed. So they will be working with the village on, and the village forester on figuring out how they can preserve trees or replace trees and get a path through that parkway area. So that got approved at their first September meeting, and then the garage variation was approved at their second meeting. Additionally, we do have an agenda item on tonight based on a village board discussion about accessory office uses. So that's pretty much our board update.
Okay. Next, I'll call to order the public hearing PZ 20-06, the zoning code and municipal code text amendments for garages and driveways. Various changes to the village's garage and driveway regulations affected sections include, but may not be limited to, Section 841 definitions, 844 width encroachments, 1073 accessory structures and uses, 1010.7 non-conforming residential driveways. The petitioner is the Village of Riverside. Note that all commissioners are still present. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Public notice was published in the Landmark on September 2nd and will be entered into the record as an exhibit. Is Director Bailey? Oh, anybody who's going to give testimony, please stand if you're able. Raise your right hand. That would be Director Bailey and Director Abt. Could you stand, please? Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is true to the best of your knowledge?
Yes.
Thank you. So, are you starting?
Yep, I'll
Okay.
start. So, as some of you may recall, we started a journey on garages and driveways back in 2017, 2018. We considered a text amendment that addressed attached garages and driveway widths and their potential negative impact on our landmark designation, the general plan of Riverside, and also on neighborhood character. Ultimately, there were several concerns about the implications of the proposed code changes, nonconformities it might make, feasibility of some of the requests, and ultimately the village board did not approve that text amendment.
Can you pull the microphone a little closer? I'm having trouble hearing with the air conditioner.
If you don't mind, I'll take this off and see if that helps a little bit. Is that better?
Yep.
Okay. In March of 2019, staff presented to the village board priority issues related to the garages and driveways amendment, since many of the things dealt with conflicts in the code or clarifying certain things. These included conflicts in our zoning code and Title 8, which is our public ways and properties section regarding driveway widths and setback requirements. There was also conflicts with the driveway apron regulations in Title 8 related to flares versus radii. We're looking for clarification on how front elevations are measured, maximum driveway widths for attached front-loaded garages, as well as nonconformities related to existing attached garages. The village board created an ad hoc committee to review staff's recommendations and to provide a recommendation to them on what changes should be made. The committee met a few times over the course of about a year and made recommendations regarding each of staff's issues and proposals. The committee did concur with several of staff's recommendations, which is basically what is before you today. So we have concurrence that Section 8.4 should be updated to regulate only driveway aprons, while the zoning ordinance would regulate private driveways. Removal of the encroachment restriction from the driveway apron regulations in Section 8.4. The creation of a maximum apron curb cut width for shared and abutting driveways. Creating an exception process for driveway aprons to exceed the maximum curb cut widths based on specific situations where road geometry or alignment might necessitate the need for a larger curb cut in order to accommodate vehicle movements. Also for clarifying how garage and facade widths are measured to provide consistency. Creating a maximum width of 10 feet for attached front-loaded garages while allowing a wider garage approach similar to what we allow for detached garages. And allow that approach to the garage to extend for 20 feet from the face of the garage, but then must taper down to a maximum of 10 feet. And also updating our non-conforming driveway regulations to clarify that existing driveways that are wider than permitted by the zoning ordinance may be reconstructed within their existing footprint. The ad hoc committee did not, however, concur with staff's recommendations regarding radius rather than flare for determining a maximum curb cut width, and they cited concerns that it would cause vehicle tires to drop off the edge of the apron. Therefore, the proposed amendment keeps the existing 3-foot flare and removes any references to radii. The 3-foot flare would also apply to the new maximum curb cut width for shared and abutting driveways. The maximum width there would be 20 feet with a maximum 3-foot flare on either side, which would result in a maximum curb cut width of 26 feet. You do have exhibits showing the difference between the radii and the flares, and then also what the required radii at the curb would be in order to allow a vehicle movement to get into the driveway unobstructed. We also had recommended considering incentives or bonuses in the garage design standards to encourage detached garages or attached garages that are set back from the front facade and some of the other kind of preferred garage treatments. The committee agreed that a cafeteria plan of bonuses was a good idea. However, they believed the focus should be on the use of permeable surfaces, green space, and trees. Therefore, staff has not included these changes in the proposed text amendment before the commission. We can discuss these further and have a separate text amendment considered at a future date. The proposed code amendment for driveway aprons establishes the 10 foot as that maximum width. It can't be any wider than the driveway that's on the private side. It allows for the 3-foot flare. We also have a definition that's added to the public ways section that actually defines what a driveway apron is versus defining what a private driveway is. The amendment creates a process for allowing a larger apron where the public works director, in consultation with the village engineer, can review the situation and determine whether or not the wider curb cut is appropriate, but in no case would they be able to approve a flare larger than 5 feet. So there still would kind of be an ultimate max on it. It also addresses private driveway width. Currently, our maximum driveway width for detached garages is 10 feet, and for attached garages, it's the width of the garage. The proposed amendment clarifies that the driveway may widen to the width of the detached garage. This additional width may only extend for a distance of 20 feet as measured from the face of the garage before it must taper to the 10-foot width. It also clarifies that the 10-foot maximum width and the additional width requirements apply to attached side-loaded and rear-loaded garages. There's also a change to change the maximum width for an attached front-loaded garage. The maximum width would be 10 feet. However, similar to detached garages, they would be allowed to be as wide as the garage, but the additional width can only extend 20 feet, similar to the detached garages, from the garage face, and then it has to taper down to a maximum of 10 feet. The amendment's also going to clarify how front facade width is measured. This was something we had discussed with the original text amendment. So front-loaded garages shall, the code states that front-loaded garages shall not occupy more than 50% of the width of the front facade of the house, as measured along any building line that faces the street. We added additional language that says, which excludes any architectural elements such as bay windows or unenclosed porches. The garage width shall be measured from the interior demising wall of the garage to the exterior wall of the garage. So again, this is to clarify for consistency as we move through different zoning administrators or different plan reviewers, that we're consistent with how we're measuring the front facade of the house as well as the width of the garage, that it's going to be from that demising wall then to the outside of the exterior wall of the garage. The proposed text amendment also addresses non-conforming driveways. It clarifies that those that exceed the maximum width permitted by the zoning code may be reconstructed within their existing footprint. This is a text amendment, so we do have standards that you can use, but you don't necessarily have to find all of these standards like you would with a variation in order to pass this. This is a legislative decision, so, but you do have those to kind of consider as you go through this. Director Bailey was the staff liaison to the ad hoc committee that reviewed the garages and driveways issues, and so he can answer any questions you have regarding maybe details on the discussion that the committee had on things. And I'm also here to answer any questions related to the proposed text amendment. You do have some exhibits here that were part of the board packet as well as the ad hoc committee's packet regarding the radii and flares, so I did include those in your packet for reference as well. And I think that's about it.
Any public input?
I did not receive any emails and we did not receive any written comments.
Okay, questions?
Questions for Director Abt
Or Director Bailey?
or Director Bailey? Yeah, I was, tell me if you can't hear me. I was curious as to why the ad hoc committee didn't like in any provision on how quickly the taper needs to occur. The taper between the first 20 feet from the face of the garage down to meeting the 10 feet width of the driveway.
So I believe the original proposal was that within 30 feet of the face of the garage, it had to get down to 10 feet, had been what the Planning and Zoning Commission's recommendation was. And so that was one of the things that they were considering. And ultimately, they recommended not having an either or and just saying it just needs to get to 10 feet.
Right, and I was just wondering if they had presented
discussion on
any
that was.
reasons for that, so that we or the village board can consider what those reasons were.
I really can't hear what you were.
Okay. Did the ad hoc committee present any reasons for why they didn't accept the staff recommendation on a condition for tapering, which would have been within 30 feet from the face of the garage?
I think the condition was either within 10 feet or at, if 10 feet couldn't be achieved, then if it would say less than 10 feet, then it had to be achieved by the, at the property line. And
That sounds familiar to me,
And
yeah.
that's what was taken out, was the at the property line condition.
Or the within 10 feet.
The-
I mean,
the
like
within
do the
10
taper within.
The
10
within the 10 feet is in here.
Is it?
Yes.
Can you point that out to me?
Item C on number 4, driveways for residential attached garages. It says, increased width is only permitted to extend for a distance of 20 feet from the garage doors before tapering back to the required driveway width of 10 feet. You're right.
It says beginning to taper back, and then the next paragraph says before tapering back to to the required driveway width. So one thing, there's an inconsistency there. One says beginning to taper, one says taper.
Yeah,
But
you're
the
right.
suggestion to me is it just starts to taper, and it could be a couple inches, you know, and slowly, and it never gets there. So that's why I was curious if they had a reason for not accepting the tapering. Because I think it's good practice to have some kind of a standard there.
The ad hoc committee simply concurred, after some discussion, simply concurred with the staff recommendation on that matter. They didn't offer alternatives. They did note an exception where there was an alternative option. They wanted to eliminate that. But staff recommendation was to allow driveways to be the width of the garage for 20 feet from the face of the garage, and then require taper back to 10 feet within 30 feet of the face of the garage. You know, that's my reporting in my memo.
Jacqueline, I apologize. That's in the memo, but it's not actually, as far as I can tell, and watch me be wrong, it's not actually in the amendment itself, the 30-foot restriction.
So we're all on the same page, literally. We're on the bottom of page 3 on 4B.
Right, yeah. In the third, the
So
bottom
you're
of the
saying-
third page of Mr. Bailey's memo.
It should then say, before tapering back to the required driveway width of 10 feet within 30 feet of the face of the garage, or something like that.
I was referring to the redlining section.
Okay. So I think that should be, yeah, that should be put back in, because it sounds like the ad hoc committee didn't disagree with it, they only disagreed to the reference to doing it by the property line. So that
Okay.
should be added back in.
So I misread that. Okay, so it would be, go back to the original recommendation of required tapering to the 10-foot width within 30 feet.
For both B and C, right?
Yes.
Okay, good.
And we'll make sure we have the language match as well, so it says tapering as opposed to beginning to taper. So we're consistent with that.
Attorney Moore says something?
So in Mr. Bailey's memo, it says, within 30 feet of the face of the garage or by the front property line, whichever occurs first. So that's what we want to add, right? The whole thing?
To me, that makes sense.
Right.
But it sounds like they eliminated the
I
second
just didn't
part.
hear the
Yeah.
whichever occurs first or the property line part.
That's fine with me.
Okay.
I don't know why they didn't include that, why they disliked that.
So we do still want to have or whichever occurs first, even though that was the part they didn't agree with?
Oh,
I think that's what we need to decide right now.
What do you guys think? Some of those driveways are pretty short.
They are, but I also think it makes it rather confusing for the public way discussion, because the public way discussion says that at least, notes that the driveway aprons shall not exceed 10 feet in width. So if you allow the taper to extend over the property line, then we get into a conflict with the public way rules.
Right.
So
I'm in
really,
agreement.
I think we should be down to 10 feet at the property line.
Right. I was just trying to get other people's opinions.
Or we could do a however cannot exceed 10 feet at the property line, if that makes it,
The implication is kind of there, right? Whichever occurs first. It's a maximum of 30 feet or the property line.
Right.
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 Agree.
I agree. So for the short driveways, they just wouldn't get down to 10 feet. I mean, because they couldn't. Well,
They would go to 10 feet at the property line.
let's say you have a 22-foot-long driveway, and they can keep it at, 18 feet, 20 feet wide for 20 feet, and they're supposed to then, I mean, I guess they could come
Yes.
in and just have a 10 feet. Oh, that's fine with me. If everyone thinks that's reasonable. It's fine.
Or if the geometry works better for them, then maybe they don't have quite as deep.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't do the full 20, maybe they do 18 and taper down just to make it a little
So-
easier.
If we're doing it that way, sorry, we might want to not allow someone to do that like within 2 inches of the property line. A max, a minimum of a 1 foot, 10 foot wide driveway length. Does that make sense? Otherwise, someone might just say, yeah, I've got 2 inches of 10-foot wide driveway, and that would look,
Weird.
maybe that's a design issue we don't want to get into, but I can see people exploiting that if it's not
Well,
specified.
I'm not sure that they're exploiting it. We are allowing them 20 feet from the face of their driveway to be as wide as we are allowing. We have a maximum value at the property line. However they decide to do that within their property, that's why they hire architects, and that's why they have computer programs to look at turning radii. If it becomes truly an issue, then they're in front of us for a variation.
Okay.
And that's how the process is supposed to work.
Could I ask a question, just from a physics standpoint? If you have a 20-foot driveway, if your garage is 20 feet from the property line, and you have to be at 10 at the property line, but it's a 2-car garage, and you've got 2 cars parked there, can they physically back out without hitting the other if it's tapering so severely down to 10?
Depending on the size of the vehicles and the quality of the drivers, yes.
Okay.
But we're going to have size issues with vehicles, we know that, but people know what they're bringing into it. I think we set a standard, and then we can go from there with variation issues.
Do we have many properties in town that have a 20-foot front yard setback?
I think that is more typical, kind of like on Quincy and Burlington. There's a few areas where they kind of start to smoosh in, maybe like on Addison and Herrick, you got a few that kind of like all of a sudden they're a lot closer to the street than, further down either way. It's not the norm that we have setbacks that small, that's for certain.
And really, the way it's written, it kind of discourages front-loaded garages, which is what we're trying to do.
Not sure if it does that. I think that would be a good result, but I'm not sure
Well,
if it
if it has to be 10 feet by the property line, and you only have whatever, 10 feet from the face of the building to the property line, then it becomes
Right, you're right. It would be hard.
geometrically
It would be
difficult.
hard, but it is going to be hard to build a new house on a lot of those tiny lots, like 30 and 40-foot wide lots on like Gage and stuff like that. That's going to be a challenge. They might have to get a variance.
Or do a detached garage.
Yeah, but then it's so narrow. There are some challenging lots, as you said. I had kind of a question or just an observation. I was wondering, we have the diagram that shows the driveway, and we talk about the apron, and we talk about
Closer
this.
to the microphone, please.
Okay. I had a question or an observation, which is this area that we're talking about that's between the garage, that 20-foot area, and then where the driveway starts. Do people agree it could be helpful to give that a name of some kind? In the regulations, I don't know what name that would be, but we have an apron, we have a turnaround area, we have driveway.
In my compliances, I typically refer to it as the garage apron
Okay.
to distinguish it from the apron in the public right-of-way, but that's kind of what I refer to it as, and people have, like for their detached garages, ones that extend 25 or 30 feet or that morph into their patio and everything else in their backyard, so.
So do you think we should put that in there? mean, I think it would be a good idea, and then to reference it in those diagrams as well, to label it in the diagrams.
It kind of seemed to me that, at least back then, the commission didn't like the term garageway apron, which is why it kind of came out of, I think, original text, I think I had put that in there, and it kind of got pulled away as things took form. So, but we can put that term in there if everybody's in agreement. Or we could call it garage approach.
Say that again?
A garage approach.
How standard is that language?
That's somewhat standard. I mean, again, sometimes driveway aprons are called approaches too, so a lot of the terms kind of
Well, if we then define it somewhere in the zoning code,
add a definition.
then that would be helpful. Or in this part of the zoning code, or in the definitions in general. I just think it could add clarity for people who are going to be applying, builders, homeowners.
Could you add it to 841 and call it driveways and aprons?
But that's for the public property. 841 is.
Right.
Does anybody have a preference on a term?
Something that's standard,
What'd you say, Joel?
something that's standardized, rather than us making up definite descriptions.
I think we already used the word approach within the code itself, so maybe we can go with garage approach. See that part of the driveway. Approaching the garage. To allow access to each garage parking space. How does that sound for a definition?
Could you read it again?
Garage approach, that part of the driveway approaching the garage to allow access to each garage parking space.
I would say adjacent to the garage or in front of, to the
I think you have to define that it's between two spaces, that it's between the apron and the garage.
Okay.
And depending on where we're putting it, you could reference the parts of the regulations that are discussing it, you know, 10-7-3E, whatever, so that it's clear, you know, as discussed in,
Okay.
I think, again, just for clarity, whatever works best.
I mean, aren't we technically just talking about a driveway at this point, though?
We're in danger of that.
I mean, we're trying to redefine a driveway here. It's the space that's between the apron and the garage.
I'd almost really rather just leave it up to the diagram. Pictures as.
And maybe just label that area approach and the 20 feet and,
That
Exactly,
might be
yes.
good enough,
Okay.
yeah.
I think that would be easier, and then there's no arguments about what we're describing because it's in the picture.
okay.
And a question for the attorney, is the diagram considered part of the code, or is it just sort of explanatory?
Yeah, I think the intent is to add this to the code, right?
Yeah,
So it is,
Diagrams are considered part of the
yeah.
code, okay.
So we will Photoshop that one and add a label for that 20-foot mark and call that out. We can also label the taper if you think that would be helpful as well.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Director Bailey, could you give us a little bit more discussion or description of the concern regarding apron flares versus radii? The reason I ask is because the recommendation from the committee is that there's a concern that vehicle tires would drop off the edge, but then when we look at the turning radius on, last page, it pretty clearly shows that a portion of the flare would never really be used.
Right. That did receive a fair amount of discussion. I would say that a minority of the ad hoc committee was concerned about that matter. Staff recommendation was to abandon the flare in favor of a radius to result in more green space. Ultimately, their discussion resulted in them not concurring. They had to reach a consensus on some action, and they wanted the matter of radius versus flare to be further examined. I'm not sure what the methodology would be or anything like that, but
And that's probably sufficient. It's basically there was a concern, but it's a minority of.
Joel, can you talk into the mic, please?
Sorry, I was
Commissioner
trying to
Martin,
talk
sorry.
to Director Bailey.
You can move your microphone if you want.
That would be too easy. I guess that helps clarify it if the committee had a concern, but it was a minority of the committee that had that concern, and the evidence that we have from staff is essentially a turning diagram that pretty clearly shows that it takes a rather creative driver to use the entire apron. I'd like to suggest that we revert to the radius requirement rather than the flare requirement.
Other thoughts on that one?
How would that work with the allowance that people can rebuild an existing driveway in its current configuration? Would they be able to keep their flare, or would they have to do the radius?
Honestly, from my experience of observing changes in the village, most driveway aprons are rebuilt during, and I'll let Director Bailey confirm or deny this, most driveway aprons are rebuilt during road reconstruction rather than by the homeowner. Typically, I think the homeowners have tried to avoid that part of it just because they don't own it and they don't have to pay for it if somebody else does it for them, i.e. the village. But if Director Bailey could give any observations on that.
In my experience, there is a surprising number of private property owners who do replace their own driveway aprons. I don't have a number or anything like that, but the department's policy is that the only time we replace a driveway apron is when we're doing a street improvement project and we pull the curb and gutter in front of the house. An example this past year was Selborne Road. We reconstructed and pulled the curb and gutter and replaced probably all of, many of the driveway aprons. If they were in good condition, we didn't replace them. But on Parkway, where we just resurfaced it and did not pull the curb and gutter, we did not replace driveway aprons there. So it's hard to tell. I mean, there's no real rule, I guess, on how frequently we would do that. Certainly, streets are only improved, I'll say, every 15 to 20 years in Riverside. So you can, and then even then, it could only be a resurfacing, which did not then result in the curb and gutter being pulled. So it's a hit or miss type proposition. There's no, I don't think there's any rule of thumb where you could say this will happen or not, but the Village Department of Public Works replaces driveway aprons, anything in the public right-of-way, to the municipal code specifications.
So I guess, and for further clarification, that section of the code is the zoning ordinance, so technically it does only regulate the private driveway section. So I would extrapolate from that if they did want to replace their apron, they would need to build the new one to the current standards unless we wrote something else into the Title 8 section. Do you have thoughts about that, Attorney Myers?
I would say, because we define driveway apron as that portion of every driveway, and the non-conforming section says existing driveways can be rebuilt, that unless we clarify it, that they could rebuild it. So if you want them not to be able to rebuild with the flare, we're going to have to say that.
So potentially adding to 10.10.7 non-conforming driveways, specifically excluding the aprons?
Yeah. Something like that.
I think that would be okay. I think we just encourage radii.
So we're discussing in the non-conforming driveways section, not allowing the apron to be placed in the same place again? Is that what we're
I
discussing?
think we're saying that we would
Okay.
continue to allow the driveway apron with the flare to be replaced in kind as we do now, but new. Do we say that if the village redoes the driveway, then we're going to build to the radii standard or not?
Personally, I don't have a really good handle on why using the radius is preferable to the flare. So maybe Commissioner Bowe, you could discuss that a little bit?
well-
What are the pluses of the radius?
The first or the second picture with the red lines on it shows how that you gain additional green space by using the radii instead of the flare. I think that's the whole point of this, is green space.
I was suspecting that might be a reason, and I wanted to make a comment here that I was a little disappointed or surprised that, the engineer, when they did this diagram, they assumed ownership and use of a 19-foot long and 7-foot wide SUV, which is like the maximum SUV, as far
I
as I
asked them
can
to
find,
do
that is
that.
on the market right now, like the very, very biggest commercial SUV. And that's what was used to see, if someone could get in and out of their driveway. So I do think that's a little excessive. I don't know how it would affect it if you used a 6-inch less long SUV or one that was 4 inches narrower, but I was just disappointed by that choice. And I would agree with having more green space if the radius would lead to more green space.
Right, the choice of showing the SUV was, the decision to show the SUV as part of the diagram was specifically related to questions that the village board was asking.
Okay.
So the question was, can an SUV make that turn can an SUV back out of its garage when another car is parked in the driveway and get out of there without going off of the driveway, without going onto the parkway, without popping the curb, those kind of
Right.
questions. So that's why we have the diagrams showing the biggest possible SUV on the market.
Well, that's, I think that's reasonable if that's what the board requested. It's just that a lot of Riverside was built before there were any cars, and the lots were laid out before there were any cars. And until the last 20 years, there haven't been such huge commercial vehicles. So I just think it makes it harder if we're going to try and design driveways on, 1870, 1880 lots that can accommodate SUVs, because the roads also were not built for
Right,
SUVs.
and that's why that other diagram was provided to show you if we wanted that type of vehicle to actually be able to make this movement in a clear way where it didn't have to go into opposing traffic or anything, that you'd have to have like a 40-foot wide curb cut in order for that to happen. So with our roads, with our geometry, it's just not physically possible for that to just happen. It's just not. Not without us basically losing our parkways.
Okay.
And that's because we are a historic community, and it's not, it's something we have to deal with. In a perfect world, in a greenfield development, we could do this and we could make it so everybody's Yukon can just slide in and out, and everybody can still be driving on the road and everything's happy hunky-dory, but that's not going to happen here in Riverside. So that was part of the reason of having that exhibit, was to show that this is what actually has to be there in order for this movement, for this vehicle to happen. The fact of the matter is a 3-foot flare, most vehicles can make that turn. Yes, they may have to use the whole road to do it, but they can make that movement.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on flares versus using the radii, saving some green space?
I mean, exactly how much green space are we talking about here? It's
I believe it was 35 square feet,
35 square feet.
34.
34?
In the ad hoc
Yeah,
memo, it says 34.
and that's on,
For each driveway.
for each driveway, but that would be on both sides of the driveway, right? So it's not 34 contiguous square feet of green space, right? It's, trying to do the math here. Yeah, so
Right.
17 square feet, which I'm
Right.
having trouble conceptualizing how much that really is. I mean, is that,
Well, 5 feet by 3 feet is 15 square
Yeah.
feet.
John, it's about the size of this table.
size of the table?
If this table is 6 feet
Yeah,
by
so
3,
that's close enough, yeah, it is, yeah, I'm trying to get a sense. To me, it's not a compelling amount, your mileage may vary.
Other thoughts?
I had a similar thought that's, 17 square feet on each side of a driveway isn't a huge gain, but in conjunction with the various other efforts the village is making to increase green space in general, I can see how it fits in.
Yeah, I'm in favor of the radius.
Commissioner Pelletier, any thoughts?
I'm just not sure that I've seen a radius used for residential driveways, almost anywhere that I can think of. So is it an aesthetic consideration?
I have one in my neighborhood, which I didn't notice until I looked, and there are no tread marks in the grass next to it. So police working at that location.
And no boulders, right, to prevent people from driving
No.
off?
Commissioner Miller?
I'm in favor of the radius. And I take the point that it's not a huge area, but again, we were talking about some lots that are not very deep. And if they have a front-loading garage, they're already going to be having probably maybe 40, 50% of their front yard is going to be driveway. So having that additional concrete or asphalt, I think on some lots could visually make quite a difference, as well as making it harder for parkway trees and items like that. So I'm in favor of the radius if it appears it's going to work for residential vehicles, which it does.
I think Commissioner Hennigan has it most accurately, and that is we spend a fair amount of time discussing pervious and impervious areas and ways to create more green space, and this seems like a relatively simple and painless way to do that. So,
Director Abt, this didn't come to us initially. If you were to do a quick mental thought experiment about how many other towns are you aware of, or even Director Bailey, that do radii versus flares?
I couldn't name any right offhand.
That's fair.
Yeah, not too many. Sometimes they'll give you an option, like I've seen that. You can have the flare, however, something, something radii, but I've never seen, like, you know, Western Springs, Oak Park. Pretty sure I looked at Hinsdale, probably Brookfield. I don't think I saw any, like, them with the radii.
Well, it sounds like the majority of the commissioners are in favor of switching to radii to save the green space. Other questions?
So given that decision, how would 844 be changed then? So we talked about, is there still an additional 3 feet at the curb permitted?
So
Yes.
the maximum width of the curb cut is going to change to 18 feet if we allow a 4-foot flare.
radius.
Or sorry, 4-foot radius. So let me try to get to that section here.
What if we did not have a maximum at the driveway? It's simply 10 feet. It's a 10-foot driveway with a 4-foot radius. I mean, that defines it sufficiently, I should think.
That's true.
And how about subsection D, where it talks about exceptions, and it says the Director of Public Works can approve in no case can the Director of Public Works approve a flare larger than 5 feet. Would that be radii of 5 feet? Is that
I
consistent?
would think so.
Or does the need for that go away if we use a radius? Because the radius does better accommodate a turning vehicle.
I think given the unusual lot sizes and configurations, there still might be the occasional case where we want to give him some discretion, him or her. Because it's only in situations where the alignment or road curvature issue makes a wider driveway apron necessary in order to reasonably accommodate a movement. So it wouldn't be based on the size of your vehicle, but it would be based on just physical alignment.
If I might just mention, that occurs quite infrequently and it usually associated with a street improvement project, but it's really more of a geometry thing. Given the curvilinear shape of the village streets, the particular angle of the driveway, sometimes they just don't match up very well within the regulations that were in place. So that's really, I think, where that is aimed, is those rather rare exceptions, rare instances where there's a geometry issue.
Director Bailey, when you were having some of these aprons rebuilt because of village needs, have people ever asked, could you widen my apron for me? And what was the response to that?
I don't recall a question about widening the apron. We build to whatever the village municipal code says. You know, if it's current, you know, it's been 10 feet at the top of the apron, can flare down to 16. Flat out, that's all we build to. We do have had some instances, really it's a geometry issue like I just mentioned, where people wished we could do something different, but we're kind of restricted by those regulations that they were 10 at the top, 16 at the bottom. It's just a few times, maybe less than 5 in my experience, maybe 3.
Okay. I had a minor comment on these sections in 844. I don't know if it will still apply going forward, but in the last sentence of 844, A and B, there's a reference that to an additional 3 feet at each, I can't read this. The one where it talks about the additional 3 feet, and it ends on each side of the driveway. I thought it should say driveway apron in those areas, because we're talking about the driveway apron there for clarity. And when you change it, you might not need to do that anymore. And the same thing on C, where it talks about the width due to fire hydrants and things like that. I don't know if you want to say no driveway apron shall be constructed, so that it's near its driveway or driveway apron shall be constructed.
Well,
So its nearest edge is within 6 feet.
But that's in the section, Title 8, Chapter 4, driveway aprons. So isn't driveway aprons assumed for all those items?
Except we've now defined driveway aprons specially in here. So if we then just refer to the driveway, to me, if I was reading it, I would say, well, it's just referring to the driveway and not the driveway apron.
Well, but A starts with residential driveway aprons. So aprons are pretty clearly what those paragraphs are talking about, right?
Okay. I can go either way. I just thought, again, for clarity, you're right, they're not very long paragraphs, and if they refer to driveway apron one place and driveway in the next place, people could assume they're still talking about the apron.
I mean, I think it's important to have consistency, so I would tend to agree, because it does say, in the exception section, we use the term driveway apron. So, I mean, I'd ask Mike what he thinks about this, where we say, the restriction sections, it says no driveway. That's a defined term. I mean, is someone going to seize on this and say, you didn't say driveway apron? It's not, you just mean the driveway. I mean, I don't see any harm in adding another word, I guess.
I agree.
All right, so we would change that second to last sentence then to a 4-foot radii at the curb line is permitted on the village parkway on each side of the driveway apron.
Okay.
And then we would use that same language for the commercial driveways.
Yep.
Well, then the last sentence of A would also be, no more than one apron shall be constructed on any lot.
I'm sorry, maybe I was looking at the wrong section. I mean, I still concur with everything that everybody just said, but then section C of 8-4, where it says no driveway shall be constructed, is the intent there to speak only of driveways, or are we speaking of driveway aprons? I mean, I'm hard-pressed to see a scenario where a driveway itself would be within 6 feet of an existing fire hydrant, although it's not inconceivable. Light or utility pole, or should that be aprons? I'm just not
Should be
clear.
apron.
It should be apron, right? Okay.
And then for D, exceptions, I would say in certain instances where there are alignment issues with the driveway and the road, a larger radii for a driveway apron may be warranted. Then the Director of Public Works, in consultation with the village engineer, shall have the discretion to approve a larger apron radii upon receipt of a request where it is determined that an alignment or road curvature issue makes a wider driveway apron necessary in order to reasonably accommodate a vehicle movement. In no case shall the Director of Public Works approve a radii larger than 5 feet.
Before we leave aprons, let's go to 10.10.7 and decide what should be there.
Is that the
Non-conforming.
non-conforming? Remind me what the question on that one was?
So it's not in the public way section. Should we do nothing and leave it the way it is? Given that there are some cases where an individual homeowner does want to replace their driveway and apron?
I think if we want people to do the radius instead of the flare, we need to specify that this doesn't apply to the apron.
So if it said existing residential driveways that are wider than permitted by the zoning ordinance may be reconstructed within its existing footprint, with the exception of driveway aprons which must be rebuilt to current radii standards.
I like it. Does everybody agree with that, or other thoughts on it?
Yes, actually.
My only concern is if, so if they're replacing their driveway because it's wider, they can do it in the footprint. Then if they have to construct the apron to the new requirements, which may be more narrow, is that problematic? Is it really,
That is true.
Right, do we want to allow them to reconstruct the driveway within its existing footprint, except that they should install a radius rather than a flare?
I think that's exactly what we're looking for them to do. So.
Yeah,
But I
So-
think,
still gets messy.
I guess you bring up the point that like for our existing front-loaded garages, currently they have 16, 18-foot wide driveways that come all the way down. If they go to replace that driveway and they want to replace the apron, say they want to switch to a paver driveway or something, if they wanted to replace the apron too, that apron then could only be 10 feet wide, and then their driveway would be 16, 18, 20 feet on the other side of the sidewalk or at the property line. So that'd be a little awkward. But then maybe they would just have to rebuild it to the new standards.
what was that?
But then maybe they would have to rebuild their driveway to the new standards
They
with having
could.
the taper.
It seems wrong somehow. You know, that,
I-
I mean, I just, from a, moral's not the right word, but if we're allowing these, non-conforming driveways to be reconstructed within their original parameters, but then to say that oh yeah, we'll let you do that, but, guess what? The apron has to go down to the
Right.
standard. I mean, that's just, I'd say, look, it's a roundabout way of getting something that we may want, and I don't think it's appropriate. So, I mean, I would lean towards, for those homes that are currently have non-conforming driveways, if they want to rebuild, the apron may remain non-conforming as well, because otherwise it's going to look awful if they do it. You're going to have an 18-foot driveway and a 10-foot apron, and it just doesn't seem appropriate. It doesn't seem the intent of the ordinance.
I think it also goes against village board intent from what we've read here, is that we're not trying to take anything away.
But as Attorney Mars suggested, the language, you're not saying they have to change the width, you're just saying instead of a flare, now you're going to have a radius. So they could keep the original width.
I think we
Based
just
on
need to
your
make that
suggested
clear, that
language.
the width is not we're not going to suddenly restrict you down to that 10 feet, but yes, we would still require the radii.
Right. So does that work for everyone?
But where does flare start? Does flare start
Usually going to start about 4 feet back from the,
where?
4 feet back from the curb.
Oh, okay.
Well, it has to be
Where?
tangent to the edge of the roadway, and tangent to
Right.
the edge of the driveway. So by definition, it's located without further definition, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's, yeah.
So I don't want to belabor this any more than we already have, but I'm just wondering if there's going to be some unintended consequences here with an 18-foot radii driveway, if we're going to make them do that. Is that actually going to, while it will provide you with more green space, no doubt, optically, when you look at it, is there going to appear to be less green space and more cement space simply because the radii is going to be, I just think it's going to look wider. I don't know. I haven't seen a radii driveway that's this big, so I don't know.
It's going to look marginally bigger at the gutter line, at the curb and gutter, but the remainder of the driveway will look smaller, and I think the first exhibit that we have, you can see that fairly well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that one shows the difference in the massing. I think that first exhibit does kind of show you the difference in the massing between the two, with them side by side like that.
And really, if you have a parkway that is an extent that's very wide, then the amount of green space you're gaining is more significant,
Sure. Yeah.
That is true.
right?
Correct.
So would you read your suggested edit again, please?
So looking at the exhibit, if this was 16 feet wide at the top, what would the radii, what would happen at the bottom?
The radii is still 4 feet. It's
Okay.
just that the width of the apron is
Got it.
wider at
Okay.
the property line, and it continues to be that 16 feet to the street with the 4-foot radii at the gutter line.
Okay.
So yes, the curb cut would be slightly wider. The curb cut would be slightly wider with the radii.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the overall square footage of that apron is going to be smaller using the radii versus
Okay.
the flare.
Existing, so let's, to address Commissioner Hennigan's point, we can add a caveat on the end mentioning the flare. So it would say, existing residential driveways that are wider than permitted by the zoning ordinance may be reconstructed within its existing footprint, with the exception of driveway aprons, which must be built to the current radii standards as opposed to existing flare. Does that work?
Yeah.
I'm seeing some nods.
Can you repeat that last part?
With the exception of driveway aprons, which must be rebuilt to current radii standards as opposed to existing flare. And I don't know if that captures it or not, but
I think that's close enough, and if we have the picture with the zoning, it's fairly understandable.
So then we'd be requiring someone who's replacing their driveway to change the dimensions of the apron, right? Is that what, because they're going from a flare to a radii, to our new radii standard? Is that what that language is saying?
But if they were wider at the top of the apron, it would only affect the bottom 4 feet, right? So we're only
Or so.
changing the bottom 4 feet if you have one that's wider than 10 feet at the top of the apron, is my understanding.
I mean, I think I'm okay with that, but I thought Commissioner Matthews' point was that that would not be fair to people if they, I mean, I think it is fair to them as long as they know what's coming so they can design their driveway in that way. but there should be a match between the width of the apron and the width of their existing driveway.
And we're not
So as long as we
changing that.
provide for that, that's fine.
And I think it would be as simple as in the, take a copy of.
Can you get, I can't hear you.
Sorry, take a copy of the radii versus flare diagram, delete the flare portion, the part that says 10 feet, you can put a caveat on there that says that that width, in cases of driveway replacement, that width may match the existing driveway width rather than being 10 feet. Perhaps better cleanup language than I have, but that's the essential idea, is that the width of the driveway, the width of the apron is allowed to match the existing width of the driveway when
At the
that
property
driveway
line?
is replaced, yes, at the property line.
That sounds good to me.
Yeah, I'd just like that made clear somewhere in the language, if for no other reason than to avoid, continuous questions for staff, because I think it should be spelled out, so.
So Attorney Mars, I don't know if you caught what Commissioner Marhul was suggesting, because I was showing you something. You were suggesting adding specific language saying that an existing driveway apron width can be maintained
Yes.
when rebuilt,
Correct.
making that explicit.
I apologize for not speaking into the microphone.
So what if it said existing driveway, what if we added a sentence to 1010-7D? Existing driveway aprons may be rebuilt to match the existing driveway width, but must use current radii standards as opposed to existing flare.
Yes. Commissioner Matthews also appears to be in agreement.
I don't know that we need existing flare, because
Yeah,
they might not have it.
That's implied, so let's leave it out.
A minor point on that section, I don't know if it still applies, but the existing sentence there, there's not a match between the beginning, the noun of existing residential driveways, and the new language, which says within its existing footprint. So just the singular noun should match with, I don't know what the grammatical term is, the its existing footprint and the end of the sentence.
Good catch.
Can you repeat that?
Would it be changed to there then?
Yeah, you could do there.
Within
or
their
you could say
existing
an
footprints?
existing driveway, and then its, or you could say existing driveways and there. So one or the other.
So then
So if we-
footprints should be plural.
Okay, got it.
In connection with this discussion on aprons, I think this impacts some of the language in 10-7-3. Like, for instance, E3C references in accordance with section 8-4-4 with encroachments of the municipal code, driveways are permitted a 3-foot flare, so that would need to be changed, on both sides of the driveway at the curb. And I think it should probably say driveway apron at the curb. And then I think that similar language appears again in the discussion of residential detached garages. There's a reference to 8-4-4.
Perhaps we could change that to driveway aprons are regulated by 8-4-4? Or driveway aprons shall be built in accordance with?
Yeah,
8
something like that. Maybe you can take out the reference to
So that way
flares,
if we ever
just
change it
reference
again-
844 as the controlling.
And you said it says that somewhere else?
In, under the.
Ah, there it
sub
is.
4, yeah.
Detached, okay, C, gotcha. Thank you. Attorney Mars?
And then in those diagrams too, there's references to flares. I don't know if those need to be changed. We're talking about new driveways.
So 3C and 4E would need to be changed to just reference to 844 for driveway aprons, rather than specifying specifically whether it's a 3-foot flare or a 4-foot radius. Just reference that.
I think that would be clearer, yes. Is that,
Okay. Do you have any wordsmithing on that one, Attorney Mars? I was going to go with driveway aprons shall be built in accordance with Section 8-4-4 with encroachments of the municipal code.
That sounds fine.
Okay.
Director Epp, on page 3 of your memo, there's a diagram for how to measure the front facade.
Do we like that one?
Are you thinking of including it in the code?
I'm willing to include it in the code if we feel like it is helpful and clear. I'm willing to fine tune if we feel it needs to be fine tuned.
So is that a wraparound porch on the left and front?
Yes,
If we're going to use it,
I'm not good at doing bay windows, so
say again?
I'm not good at drawing in bay windows, so the porch seemed the easiest thing to do.
Do you guys find this diagram helpful? Do commissioners find this diagram helpful?
Yes.
Yeah, except one issue is your definition of the garage dimension. Your leader lines are both to the interior face of that garage, and then the text of it says, shall be measured from the interior demising wall to the exterior wall of the garage. So that would imply the exterior face.
Shift it over a little bit.
I agree with that. I noticed the same thing. It just needs to be refined.
Darn snap lines.
I like the diagram too because it shows sort of an inset, because I've noticed some of the more recently built houses, some of them have extremely jagged facades. I mean, they're really, so there's, and I don't know if it would be advisable to change that reference to building line in the code, because there's no definition for what building line is in the definitions. And someone might think, you know, they might say, well, you know, building line, we're considering everything that's jutting out the farthest, but that's part of the facade that we've pushed back on the far left side. We're not considering that part of the building line, so that's not how we're going to measure the potential width of the garage, because that's not part of our facade. We've pushed it back 15 feet. So I think having that clear, that it's sort of like the width of the house, the width of the front of the house, no matter where, you know, even if it's not all along a single elevation line,
Plane.
whatever you call that. Plane, yeah.
Okay.
That would be helpful to put that in there, to change some of that old language.
Well, if we are going to use this, just maybe label that that's a front porch, open porch, somehow. Other comments, questions? We don't have anyone in the audience to comment?
I had an additional comment on the reference in 10, let's see if I can get this right. It's the sub 1073, the subparagraph. B, which is under figure 7. It's like the last line under figure 7. And it says, for attached front-loaded garages, the portion of the driveway approaching the garage is permitted to widen to the width of the garage. And that term, width of the garage, is not defined anywhere. And in a separate section, we talk about, when we're talking about the facade, we talk about the interior demising wall and the exterior wall. But here, there's no discussion of the width of the garage. The old code before, the existing code right now, before these changes, used that struck out language right above, which says, references the garage walls. The width of the garage as measured from the garage walls. So I think we need some kind of a definition or a reference in that paragraph B, subparagraph B.
And two other areas as well. I thought we discussed this already. Does,
We're talking about width of driveway.
yes.
This is the width of the
we came up
garage.
with specifics on this.
I thought at some point we discussed limiting the width of the driveway approach, if you will, to be like 2 feet wider than the garage doors.
In the past, yeah, in the past meetings, yes.
Right.
Yes, and I believe that was part of the amendment that tanked.
Part of what?
Part of the amendment that tanked. That was language that you had added in
That
there.
someone took exception to.
I think so.
Well, what are your thoughts on that? So what was your memory? 2 feet wider than the garage doors?
The garage doors, the vehicular doors.
Is that your memory as well?
I don't know who had exception to it, but I've looked at a lot of driveways, including in some new
I think it was an
houses.
either or,
And they
wasn't it?
really only, often they meet the edge of the garage doors, or they just go past like another 4 or 6 inches. So I don't really see a lot that want an extra foot or two on either side of their garage. So I would be in favor of saying the edge of the garage doors plus, I don't know, maybe 6 inches on either side. But I don't know what anyone else thinks.
Well, that doesn't really fall in line with the diagram here. The diagram showing your driveway lines up with your exterior face of your exterior wall. So we'd be showing one thing and saying another. I'm in favor of saying exterior face of exterior wall to exterior face of exterior wall. Let the homeowner decide if that's what they want to fill out to. You might have somebody who's got a small portion of land that they don't want to just stop the driveway, they want to run it out.
So how would we define since we're talking about attached garages, how would we define the exterior wall? Because there isn't an exterior wall. Would it be the edge of the trim? Would it be actually the interior demising wall, even though we don't see that? I think we need some kind of a definition for that.
Sure.
And then that does get into the whole concept of the width of the facade of the garage as a proportion of the entire house, because you have this void of the driveway, which is sort of matching with the garage and the garage doors. So I think that gets to that issue. So if we're measuring the width of the garage as part of the facade to the interior demising wall, maybe we want to offer that for the width of the driveway too. So there's consistency there. And not require someone to do that, but just say it can be as wide as that.
Any thoughts?
I mean, I think we could just use the language in the in 10.7.3.8.2 where the garage, so the portion of the driveway is permitted to widen to the width of the garage as measured by, or as measured from the interior demising wall of the garage to the exterior wall of the garage. Would that be, is that sufficient, you think?
Yeah, I think for me, that would be consistent and reasonable, and then again, we're referring to the same terminology, the same concept, and not having different.
Well, we also need it for residential detached garages, so 3B on page 3. And on page 4, 4C. So for the detached garage,
Yeah, for the detached garage, maybe you want it to extend to the exterior wall, or somehow it's symmetrical with the detached garage.
Yeah, I think Commissioner May's language works for those, what you said earlier, exterior walls.
And what, Chairperson Mateo, what was the other one?
on page 4, under C, for attached garages located in rear or side loaded. Actually, we have an extra word in there.
Do you want to make width of garage a defined term at the beginning?
Can you say that again, please?
Do you want to make width of garage a defined term in 841?
Makes sense.
So we could take the one that Commissioner Matthews pointed out for the attached, and then specify for the detached the wall-to-wall.
Where are we putting that?
We would add it in 841 as a definition.
Yeah, but that's the municipal code.
That what?
That's in the municipal code,
Oh,
not in the
okay.
zoning code. So I don't want to add
Oh, yeah, I see.
private property stuff and
Gotcha,
muddy the
gotcha.
waters again.
Okay.
We'd have to put it in, would that be 10, 11, 4? Definitions? Other?
Well, then in the zoning code, each time it's width of garage that's referencing an interior, we could use, the one from the building code, and then for detached, use as measured from
Wall to wall?
wall to wall. Just specify it after each reference to width of the garage.
Okay.
Does that work?
I think that's okay.
Make it so. So staying on the rear or side garages, can we take out loaded garages? For attached garages located to the rear or side, the driveway that provides access? See what I'm saying?
Yeah, instead of side loaded, just make it side.
Take out loaded garages?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Does anybody have any further questions for Director Bailey right now so he can sit down
I don't, oh.
if he chooses to?
I don't think so, and I think that staff has already recommended that in their memo on item 7, that any kind of bonuses get deferred to a separate text amendment. Is that am I reading that correctly? I suppose then the one question for Director Bailey is, why did the committee stick with just the green space type items rather than the bonuses for location and setback and such?
Would you restate that, please?
In the ultimate recommendation, the committee, the ad hoc committee suggested that any kind of bonuses should be limited to green space construction, i.e. Permeable surfaces, green space, and trees. And my question was, why did the committee seem to veer away from harder, as in constructed items that would generate a bonus?
There was not a lot of discussion on that matter, especially debating different options as far as incentives or bonuses. It was just as that motion was developing and made by one of the committee members, that was what the motion emphasized, is those three items. There wasn't any back and forth on, merits of different bonuses. It was just that that's where they wanted the emphasis to be.
Okay. No, thank you, and that helps. And I think to the chairman, are we then saving this bonus discussion and a potential text amendment for another meeting? Because
Yes,
that
and-
really applies to larger issues within the zoning code.
Right, and there will be some other things that we previously addressed that we will return to as well.
Thank you.
Could I get the exact wording for the measurement of the detached garages before we leave that subject?
What I said is the measurement of the exterior face of the exterior wall to the exterior face of the exterior wall.
Thank you.
Anything else?
We're just going through any other suggestions for changes, okay. In 10-7-3, A8B, 2 and 3, this is the old text, which refers to the front facade of the house in 2, and then in 3, front facade of the building. And I think in both those places, it would be better to say the front facade of the principal building, because I think that's a defined term in the zoning code. And house just kind of, I don't know if we use it anywhere else, it just pops up there. And then we discussed doing something, I think, Director, after we agreed to do something about building line or front building line in those 2 paragraphs, to sort of clarify what the building line is, because that's not defined in the code.
I thought we were going to do that with the diagram.
Through the diagram?
Right.
Yeah, we could do that, as long as there's like a reference to as shown in the diagram or something like that. And then in that, so then I had a few comments on the concept of 50% of the width of the front facade for the front-loading garage, if this is a good time to make that comment. Yes?
Sure.
So I disagree with 50%. I think that the width of the front-loading garage should not be equal to the width of the facade of the principal building of the house. I think that's inconsistent with what we want to do, at least in most of the village. I think one way to approach it, which I've discussed in the past, is for the board or for us to have different facade measurements depending upon which either residential district or which geographical area of the village we're talking about. We have some areas which are more historic, which were laid out by Olmsted, which are more important to the landmark designation. And then we have some areas like along, like along Gage or Burlington, where it's a much greater challenge for building. So I think that's one way to approach it. But in general, I would prefer if it said shall not occupy more than 45% of the width of the front facade of the principal building, maybe even 48%, just so that there's not an equivalency there.
Well, as I said, we're going to have further discussions, and what we're addressing today is what the ad hoc committee dealt with.
Okay.
So we could save that for our future
So that will be a
follow-ups.
further discussion, okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that. In the redlining part of that paragraph 2 there, though, I did also wanted to suggest that instead of saying which exclude any architectural elements and then list them, if instead we said something like which exclude any items that Table 7 permitted encroachments reference as being allowed to encroach into a side yard or something like that, so that we're not trying to do a partial list. And I don't think there are that many things in that table. There are unenclosed porches, there are maybe chimneys, window wells, things like that.
Okay. So architectural elements, instead of saying architectural elements, you would say encroachments. That's 10.7.4 table. Oh, that's not going to be it. Okay, so
Do you have a suggestion, Commissioner Marvel?
I'd like to release Director Bailey.
Yes, please sit down if you want.
Okay, thank you.
thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right. So which excludes any encroachments as listed in 10.7.4 and then reference the table?
Is listed in table, what is it, table 5 or table 7?
Table
Permitted
7.
encroachments? Yeah.
I think I would find it confusing if we refer to those items as encroachments for the purpose of making this calculation, because they're only encroachments if they're within that required yard. If they're within the buildable area of the lot, they're not encroachments.
That is true.
So I think that would add some confusion there. So if you
Maybe
have
we
a
can
front porch
phrase it-
that's within the buildable area of the lot, it's not encroaching into anything. So does it get counted or does it not get counted if we're only referring to encroachments?
So if somebody builds their bay window to the side setback line, that could then still be included in the width, or the chimney could be included in the width.
Well, then maybe we could say items that are listed, and that, because my suspicion would be most of the time people are building to the max, and then they have their allowed encroachments, like their chimney and their bay window and their unenclosed porch, but they're trying to expand their footprint on their lot even more. But you're right, if you have a very wide lot, that might not be the case. But I just think referencing architectural elements and then having a partial list could get us into trouble. That's all. I never like lists like that, partial lists. So maybe there's a different way to reference it. maybe maybe not architectural element, I just, who knows?
Any thoughts on that?
Jennifer, Sean, any magic words you can pull out of your hat that we could use for things like
Appurtenances?
the beloved appurtenance? Yes.
Can't hear.
I said appurtenances somewhat in jest.
Still in here.
Appurtenances.
You could do both. You could list some examples and refer to the table.
As
Anything
an
else?
aside on this, until tonight, I didn't realize that unenclosed porches were allowed in the side yard as encroachments with no limitation. So arguably, they could come up to the property line, I think, whereas some encroachments are limited to within 2 feet or something like that. I don't know if that's what was intended by the board a couple of years ago when they made those changes, but that surprised me.
Unenclosed porches are not allowed to encroach into a side yard.
They are, aren't they?
No, they're not.
Unenclosed porches are not?
Only into a street yard. Only into a street yard.
Really?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Let me double check.
Anything else? Is there a motion to close or continue the public hearing?
Motion to close?
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Who did
All
the
right.
motion to close?
And Commissioner May seconded. Would somebody like to put a motion on the table for discussion?
I would move to recommend that we approve the proposed text amendments as amended this evening.
Okay. Okay. Further discussion? Or should we go to the standards? That was a good discussion. All right, so again, we don't have to fulfill all of these standards, but we'll go through them. A, the extent to which the proposed amendment promotes the public health, safety, comfort, and convenience and general welfare of the village. Addresses some public health issues, I would say. B, the relative gain to the public as compared to the hardship imposed upon the applicant. The applicant is the village, so the public does benefit. C, the consistency of the proposed amendment with village plans. Enhances green space, among other things. D, the consistency of the proposed amendment with the intent and general regulations of the zoning ordinance. Let's say it improves it. E, whether the proposed amendment corrects an error or omission, adds clarification to existing requirements, or reflects a change in policy. I think that's what we're doing, right? F, that the proposed amendment will benefit the residents of the village as a whole, and not just the applicant, property owners, neighbors of any property under consideration, or other special interest groups, and the extent to which the proposed use would be public interest that would not serve solely the interest of the applicant.
Yes.
It's village-wide. G, whether the proposed amendment provides a more workable way to achieve the intent and purposes of the zoning ordinance and village plans. H, the extent to which the proposed amendment creates nonconformities. We don't think we are. I, the extent to which the proposed amendment is consistent with the overall structure and organization of the zoning ordinance. Hopefully it's making it more consistent. Any further discussion? Okay, please call the roll.
All right, Commissioner Hennigan,
Aye.
Commissioner Marhol,
Aye.
Commissioner Miller,
Aye.
Commissioner Pelletier,
Aye.
Commissioner Matthews,
Aye.
Commissioner May,
Aye.
Chairperson Mateo.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Our recommendation will go to the village board. Thank you, everyone, for your hard work on that. Next up is new business, a discussion regarding allowing habitable space above detached garages and in coach houses.
Hang in there, it's folded in my exhibits. Okay. So, at their September 3rd meeting, the trustees discussed the potential for allowing home offices above detached garages. This was initiated by trustee Gisa, noting that with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's kind of changed the way people have worked, and that it's forced many companies to rethink how they do business, and he believes that working from home is going to become more and more popular. He noted the ability to convert a space above a garage or a coach house into a home office and work there would make it easier to work from home and increase the property's value. He also suggested it could increase economic activity within the village with more people being home during the day rather than commuting into the city. He used Hinsdale as an example, where they can create a living space above the garage provided it does not contain all the elements of a dwelling unit. As part of their discussion, the trustees did express some concerns about enforcement and visitors and home occupations and possibly renting the space to others or them being illegally converted into dwelling units. But ultimately, they believe the issue was worthy of further discussion and exploration, and they referred the matter to this commission for further review. And they also asked that as part of that we review the home occupation regulations to address any potential negative impacts related to creating that office use above the garage. The current regulations for detached garages do not permit living space above the parking area of a garage except for storage. So this is with the exception that our actual landmarked coach houses are allowed to have the living space above them. So that's really the only caveat within there. Otherwise, all detached garages, you're not allowed to have a habitable space, a living space above the garage. So our garage regulations also regulate maximum wall height in addition to peak height. This was specifically put in place to limit the ability of creating livable space above the garage. It was also put in there to limit the height of like a flat roof garage as well, is my recollection when we were having previous discussions about this over the past several years. So what I provided you with is what our regulations as well as our home occupation regulations. I looked at some surrounding communities and really, I think LaGrange and Hinsdale are the only ones that came up that definitely specifically would allow for living space above a detached garage. The other communities have regulations that specifically say there can be no habitable space in a detached garage. So, that's kind of where kind of comparable communities in our area are at. A lot of them range from their building height for accessory buildings from like 14 to 16 feet in height. None of the ones that I looked at had a sidewall height restriction. So that's kind of, looking at comparison, if we take out the sidewall height restriction, what does that necessarily open up that we might have to look at? And the one thing that I thought of with that is, again, for flat roofs, how do we restrict the height on that so we don't have a 16-foot tall flat roof, if we care? I mean, if we don't care, then we don't care. But at one point we did, and that's part of why we had the 12-foot sidewall height restriction. So just kind of looking for feedback from you about kind of what questions you would have about that, what other information I can provide you to help us kind of further this discussion and work through any potential issues that we see, what other communities possibly are doing. This is not necessarily morphing into an accessory dwelling unit discussion. The board was pretty clear that they were looking at exploring this as just office space, not necessarily creating an accessory dwelling unit. So I kind of want to try and keep from going down that path too far, although there could be regulations that we could look at that other communities have, out of state, other areas, about accessory dwelling units that could help us look at what's feasible for, building heights, peak heights, things like that. Because with a 12-foot sidewall, a 16-foot peak height, unless you're doing a more voluminous roof, how much usable space are you going to have above there? Now, granted, most people don't build a 12-foot sidewall. I mean, you're typically looking at probably like a 10-foot, is typically, I think, what we see, maybe a little bit lower than that. People aren't putting in ginormous garage doors that they need to be taller than that. But still, even then, you don't have a lot of space there. Maybe if they bump out some dormers, that gets them a little bit more usable space. But if we want this to be feasible, what is really necessary to make that happen? So some of the discussions I'm trying to have is talking with some architects and builders, and maybe Commissioner May can provide some feedback in that. If we have to have 7-foot clearance for it to be a habitable space, what kind of overall heights are we looking at for a functional garage and a functional office above there? So hopefully I haven't muddied the waters too much, but.
Thoughts?
I really like the idea of exploring allowing habitable space above garages. I'm less enamored of the idea of it being for the purpose of a home office. I think there could be a lot of potential negatives in allowing people to run businesses from a garage, in that it really could create a commercial use in a residential district. Once you allow that habitable space, people will use it for all sorts of purposes. There may be home offices, there will be play areas and workout rooms and all sorts of things like that, and teenagers will move their bedrooms into them. None of which is to say that any of that's good or bad, but the only one of that I really have some reservations is specifically allowing people to run businesses from their garages, particularly when you'll be inviting visitors onto the property for that purpose. Does that potentially create accessibility issues if the function of this building goes from being primarily a storage space to a place of commercial business? Those are some of the things that I'd want to learn more about.
It's not a great idea code-wise. You're doing a business occupancy over a storage occupancy. You need a 2-hour separation between the two, and most people aren't going to want to build a 2-hour separation between the underside of their garage and the business occupancy upstairs. Plus, you need to make sure that the supporting walls of the garage can withstand 2-hour burn. So you're talking about people making basically a heavily reinforced garage to support what's typified as a business class occupancy for a second floor. I think it's best left for a homeowner to decide how are they using this space. I don't think you want to formally declare that anything is a business occupancy out there, though.
Other thoughts?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, it seems to me that this would require such a comprehensive, changes to the, the height restrictions that we currently have in the zoning code that, I'm not even sure we need to get to the, to discuss the business issues, the allowing people to run a business out of the garage, because it's hard for me to, you're not going to be able to do it in any garage now. You won't be able to build an office on top of your garage unless you come to us for a variance or unless we change the zoning code. That's just not going to happen. So, my feeling is that that's the important part for us. So that's where I would go back to the board with and say, you know what? you guys decide this. You say if you want people to be able to do business out of their garages, whatever, you make that decision. But, remember, then we're going to have to change this code completely. Garages are going to look very, very different if people do this. It's going to change the character of neighborhoods, and it may be something that we decide we don't want to do. But I think that's where it all comes down to, and I don't want to say falls apart, but it's not a threshold issue. It's the opposite. It's an issue that's looming in the distance. Once they decide they want to allow people to use their garages to work from, then we have to say, well, all right, change the code then, and change it in a big way, in a very, very big way. Sean I didn't even think about that, but I think what I'm thinking about is the tip of the iceberg, some of the other stuff. So I think that's what we tell them.
And I suppose the question is, why would you want to formally change the occupancy to business instead of just work from home? I don't understand what the goal is.
I think it was to allow work from home, and they want us to frame it in a way that wouldn't have it be where it would be there was concerns about it becoming the sole location of a home occupation. And so that's why they wanted us to look at the home occupation regulations as well. So, and they certainly didn't want it to suddenly become rentable space where somebody is leasing out to somebody for office space, their home office above their garage.
Yeah, I think the idea was you might have two parents working at home and you have the kids schooling at home. This is an extra space for one of those adults, in theory, to work outside of the principal residence. It wasn't to have a home business operating officially from the garage. Now, how you prevent that from happening is another discussion for all of us.
And that's why the home occupation standards are part of the discussion. So some of the concerns about customer traffic, we address those in the home occupation. The idea that the property is remaining principally residential with this, you're essentially taking an office that may be in the house and allowing it to be out there. And I don't think it was limited to offices. You could do other types of spaces, right? So long as it didn't become a dwelling unit.
Right. I think they were primarily talking about it as the ability for somebody to utilize it as their home office.
And add a half bath, perhaps.
But yeah, they didn't, but also qualifying that they didn't want it to easily morph into it being converted into a dwelling unit.
Right. So I work with Hinsdale where they do allow these, and in most cases it's going to be, new construction garage. It's not retrofitting for the most part. But they make sure the utilities are running from the house. You're not creating separate utilities, so there's not, to try to limit the possibility of there being an occupant out there. And one of the big differences between Riverside and Hinsdale is Hinsdale does not do transfer inspections. So to the extent that somebody was trying to turn this into an illegal dwelling unit, you have the opportunity here in Riverside to catch that upon transfer. And Hinsdale doesn't have that same opportunity, so they have developers who, will put some pretty tricked out spaces above garages and push the envelope some.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the genesis of this new allowance in Hinsdale? Is it recent?
It's not new, no.
Okay.
It's historic. That they've
But
always done that.
it is primarily new construction.
Well, that's been my experience with it. So staff has come to me in instances where we have questions about somebody when they're building this, and for the most part, those are new garages going up as opposed to retrofitting questions. But there are bigger, older garages where they, may be redeveloping it, but a lot of times it's newer.
In our use standards, it says that a home occupation shall not exceed 25% of the total floor area of the principal and/or accessory building.
Right, so
In
that's something
somewhere
that
like
would have to
Hinsdale,
be-
is there a limitation on the percentage, or can you have your entire accessory building being used for non-residential?
In Hinsdale?
Yeah, in Hinsdale.
I don't know.
Okay.
I'd have to look. And that's something we probably have to change here if we're going to allow
Right, because 25%.
50% garage on the bottom and 50% accessory use upstairs, so.
Right.
Yeah, we haven't gotten that far into the discussion where we're kind of comparing what the different towns have.
I think it's interesting. It kind of dovetails with what someone had mentioned earlier. Since Mr. Mars brought up the issue of this being in primarily new construction, I mean, if we're trying to discourage, or if that's the right word, but we're trying to discourage, attached garages in the front of homes. And then if this goes, then it'll be a detached garage, but it'll be twice as high as any other detached garage on the block for new construction. Maybe not twice as high, but it's going to be significantly higher. So in one respect, you're saying, well, we're concerned about the aesthetics. So instead of doing the attached garage, where they could build something above it with the new construction, they'll build a detached garage, and you'll be looking at the driveway, and you'll be seeing essentially a 2-story house back there. So I think this is there's aesthetics issues here too that I think we need to look at, and intent of some of the rules and ordinances that we try to enforce.
Other thoughts?
I think just adding to what Commissioner Matthews, Hennigan, and May said, adding the ability to put utilities to an accessory structure, no matter whether or not they're off of the principal building's utility bills or not, seems like a slippery slope as well with regards to creating a potentially habitable space, because it's once you have water and sewer to a garage, it's not that complicated to make the services within the garage grow beyond just a bathroom.
Certainly right now, I think that people could use garages for everything but, cooking. And I mean, they could still sleep there. Someone could sleep there overnight. And just because especially if you have an attached garage. I mean, there are a number of garages in Hinsdale, not in Hinsdale, in Riverside, that I'm guessing are not used as garages, because you always see the cars outside. So, and I don't know if inside it's only being used for storage. So people are doing things with their garage spaces that I assume government doesn't know about. And, I mean, I think as Commissioner May is probably right. I don't know if we want to allow that to continue under the table. It's fine. I don't know if we want to authorize it officially. It might be a bad move.
Any thoughts?
No new thoughts.
I think part of the motivation of bringing this up was that it would make it it could potentially improve home values. You're creating more usable space and making it more of a destination, making Riverside more of a destination for people who are planning to work from home in the future. So, as that becomes more common.
Honestly, I think the current environment that we're living in right now has proved that people can create a usable office space pretty much anywhere without having to invest in additional space above a garage.
That's exactly right. That's where my thought process was, is it looks like you're just looking for free space to build up and maybe improve your property, as opposed to using your own home office or basement or any other space that you've got set aside. It seems like a loophole to exploit the FAR, maybe.
I mean, you can just put an addition on your house as well.
I assume Trustee Gisa had some idea of this, of real instances where this could or was already happening. Someone happened to have a garage space or whatever.
think
And
some
so
of-
he had something that he was actually thinking about.
I think his thought process was that there are people who have existing coach houses that
Coach
are
houses, yeah, are different.
not landmarked coach houses that do have a space above, and could they be utilized, continue to be utilized for an office space or finished out, you know, if they're really dated or whatever, for an office space, provided we put caveats in there so that they could not be turned into a dwelling unit.
I suppose for the purposes of our discussion, would it be possible for staff to investigate how many of these non-landmarked coach houses exist and are potentially available for use for living space?
I think so, because I think we had to do an inventory of coach houses back in like the 90s when they were first changing the code to allow coach houses to be landmarked in order to be utilized as dwelling units. So I'll have to go through some of the historical files and see if I can find some of those lists, and maybe that's something we can build off of.
I think that would be an appropriate place to go and meet the intent of Trustee Gisa's thoughts.
And then would our current use standards for home occupation simply allow whatever is happening in those coach houses or could happen? I mean, maybe there'd be some specific tweaks that need to be made to those use standards to change them to allow this, but
I think the home occupation would allow for it. I think it's our specific garage regulations that say only storage above the garage that kind of puts a little hitch in that giddy up.
Right.
So,
but there probably aren't that many garages that qualify as having, because of the peaked roofs and all the rest. Again,
And they probably go back to what Commissioner May stated about fire, safety, and other dwelling requirements.
So who would like staff to investigate further? And if so, what information would you like?
As stated, I'd like to know how many non-landmark coach houses are potentially available for this use.
And I'd like to see the ordinances for LaGrange and Hinsdale.
So there's tiny offices that you can build as standalone structures, like 10 by 10, 10 by 12. Do we want to look at those?
I'd rather not.
I mean, technically, our code would allow that. We allow accessory buildings in the aggregate not to exceed 800 square feet. So if somebody had, you know, depending on the size of their existing detached garage, they could do a second accessory building. I mean, some people have a shed, you know, in addition to their garage that they use for storage. I mean, we certainly have people who have built workshop additions onto the back of their existing garages, office or studio additions onto the back of their garages. I don't know too many that are separate buildings, but there have been people who have expanded their garages or put a third bay onto their garage that's, you know, their workshop area, bumped out that back wall of their garage to create a workshop area, addition on the back to create an office.
and those are areas where some people could do business, or they could just write a book, or write poems, or paint, or whatever,
Exactly.
right? Just for a vocation. So it's really hard to,
One of my first
Regulate
ones when
that.
I first here was for a little personal yoga studio in their back of a garage, so,
But currently, they couldn't have plumbing, correct?
right. So nothing that would allow it to be able to be easily converted into a dwelling unit.
Any interest in that?
What would this be? I mean, it's like a freestanding structure is what you're talking about? And it's already allowed by code, right? Wouldn't it
So
be?
it's allowed,
Like a
but
shed.
would we want it to be allowed to have plumbing? Could it have a
Yeah.
toilet?
I'm not too interested in in a 10 by 10 foot structure in my neighbor's yard with a toilet. I think I think you'd see some pushback from the community, deservedly so on that one.
But a specific question on that, let's say someone has a garage and they have a workshop. When we're talking about plumbing, we're talking about a toilet, right? We're not talking about a sink or a faucet, because that's allowed, is it not?
Yeah.
It must be.
We've allowed
Talking about
sinks, but
plumbing,
not,
we're
yeah,
talking about like sewage plumbing, sewage connection.
showers, bathrooms.
But people have outdoor showers and,
It's-
you know, you can buy like one of those stands and put it outside your,
It seems that our existing code provides sufficient opportunity for limited use spaces.
yeah, I agree.
I'm not sure where the value is in creating additional requirements on those accessory structures.
Any other information you want? Okay. Our next meeting is October 28th. Do we know if we already have something on the agenda?
I don't know yet. Deadline is next week, so
Okay.
we will see.
Anything else?
Okay, I move to close this PCC meeting.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
I
Thank you, everyone.